Greenland. Over 80% of it is covered with snow and ice, perhaps one of the reasons why it's the least densely populated place on the planet. Despite being the largest non-continental island in the world, it has a population of only 56,000 people, creating a population density of 0.14 people per square kilometer. Oh, and it's owned by Denmark. Well, kind of. We'll dive into the reasons why Greenland is part of Denmark today and what the future might hold for this landmass soon. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, why is Greenland part of Denmark? Greenland wasn't always the isolated icy island we know today. The first people to set foot on it were the Inuit, who arrived around 2500 BC, but not by boat. The waters of the Thule Channel froze over, creating a natural ice bridge that connected the Canadian Arctic islands to Greenland. This allowed the Inuit to make their way across the Arctic and establish a foothold on the island. Historians believe the first migrants died out, but there were several waves of migrations that continued after the first settlers disappeared. The latest wave, and the people that the modern-day Greenlanders are descended from, was the Thule people. While sources disagree on the exact time frame, most historians believe that the Thule had settled Greenland by 1100 to 1200 AD. However, another group had also shown up before that. That group was led by Norwegian outcast Eric the Red. In 982 AD, Norway expelled Eric the Red from one of their then communities in Iceland for killing another person. Being persona non grata in his town, Eric braved the frozen northern seas and sailed west from Iceland, probably wondering if he should have just asked for a prison sentence instead. Eventually, he came upon an ice sheet, but on closer inspection, he could make out a shoreline and some actual land. Of course, there were Inuit people from the previous migration still living in Greenland, but Eric the Red might not have encountered them right away, and even if he did, he couldn't really communicate with them. In 985 AD, Eric the Red set sail back to Iceland, probably hoping the local government had forgotten he was a wanted man, but he didn't return quietly. Instead, he stirred up excitement amongst the crowds, claiming he had discovered a new land. In one of history's earliest marketing scams, Eric cleverly named the ice-covered island Greenland to make it sound like a lush, fertile paradise. A bold move, considering over 80% of it was buried in ice. Now, to be fair to Eric, the part of southern Greenland he eventually settled in can turn quite green during the summer. To be more fair to history, it's unlikely he had sailed to Greenland and spent any amount of time there without realizing that most of the land was absolutely useless for farming and distinctively not green. With a gaggle of excited Norwegians in tow, Eric the Red made his way back to Greenland and created two communities there, the West and the East settlements. The Norwegian population got up to 2,000 to 3,000 people, running around 280 farms in total. So Eric did partly deliver on his promise. His son, the more famous Leif Erikson, who had spent the last few years rapidly Christianizing Norway, arrived on the island to reunite with his daddy. When he arrived, Leif took a look around at the glaciers and the seals and the ice, and he decided what this place really needed was Jesus. Determined to bring faith to the frozen frontier, Leif spread Christianity amongst the settlers, and by 1126 Greenland had its own bishop's seat. But how would the populations of Norwegians and Inuit end up interacting? Well, if you know anything about European-American relations in history, you can probably guess not well. The Norwegians made the same mistake countless European settlers would repeat for centuries. They tried to live as they did back home, refusing to adapt to their new environment. It's the same reason the Pilgrims, hundreds of years later, would nearly starve before the Native Americans saved them from starvation. The Norsemen brought in domesticated animals like cattle and pigs. They set up farms in the same way they would have back home, and they lived a quiet farmer's life. There's some indication that while they settled the land, the climate in Greenland was a little bit warmer than what it would eventually become, so perhaps these practices seemed like they would work at the time. The Inuit, on the other hand, who had migrated from the climates more closely aligned with Greenland's, lived off what the land itself offered. They positioned themselves in places where they could maximize hunting and fishing opportunities, unsurprisingly two of the biggest industries in Greenland today. That meant that the Inuit settled temporarily in the outer fjord regions closer to the sea, while the Norwegians settled the inner fjord regions suitable to farming. So whenever the fish reserves started to reduce in one area, the Inuit could get up and move along the coast. The Norwegians, however, were tied to their farms, and any fluctuations of the fertility of the land or the climate would decimate them. Perhaps that's why, by 1500, the population of Norwegians on Greenland seemingly vanished altogether. Another theory states that hostile relations between the Inuit and the Norsemen led to the latter's demise. When local Norsemen wrote down the saga of Eric the Red, they used very unflattering terms to talk about the Inuit. Similarly resentful terms are used in Inuit stories about the Norsemen. It was clear the two groups did not get along. Furthermore, it seemed that when the two sides clashed, as far as experts could tell, the Inuit often won. Being better fed and more adapted to the climate will do that. When the Norsemen's farms started to fail, they didn't do as good a job fishing or surviving the cold winters. They didn't have the tools and the gear the Inuit had honed and crafted after millennia of living in the tundra. And due to the awful relations between the two peoples, they never got them either. Also imagine just how inhospitable Greenland is that Norwegians and Icelanders of all people found the climate too challenging. Regardless, around 1500, Greenland once again became the land of the Inuit, and only the Inuit, but not for long. Dutch and English whalers started expanding their trade westward during the 16th and 17th centuries, and they would occasionally come into contact with Greenlanders. However, the relations between them seemed much less strained than previous European and Inuit relations, perhaps because at first no one showed any interest in colonizing an island that was 80% ice. But for many countries, including the US, this stance would change in the coming centuries. That was until 1721. Hans Ea, operating with the permission of the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway, those two were joined back then, settled in Nuuk to open a trading company and a Lutheran mission, because apparently Europeans just couldn't go anywhere without starting a church in those days. Other major powers continued to trade with Greenland until 1776, but by then the English and the French were busy fighting over land and revolution further south. So Denmark declared a monopoly trade on Greenland for themselves. No other foreigners could land on Greenland's coast, and Denmark used this time to try to gradually introduce the Inuit to the outside world without opening the land up for economic exploitation, by others at least. This monopoly lasted until 1950 with a few exceptions, a few surprisingly involving the US, who had a strange off and on again relationship with Greenland over the years. It's been in the news quite a lot lately, but the first time the US flirted with acquiring Greenland was around 1867. Secretary of State William Seward had just bought Alaska from Russia and decided that while he was on a hot streak buying ice-covered mineral-rich territory, perhaps he should just give Greenland and Iceland a go as well. In a strange reflection of a more recent time in US policy, Seward was also interested in Canada. Seward wasn't just after Greenland's minerals and fisheries, he had a bigger plan. If the island became a part of the US, Canada would find itself sandwiched on three sides by the US: Alaska, Greenland, and the other states. This might force Canada to join the relatively young nation. If you can't beat them, join them. However, in a not unusual turn for the US or any other major power for that matter, the small matter of what the people already living in Greenland wanted was entirely forgotten. Encountering resistance by both Greenlanders and Danes, Seward's plan to acquire Greenland flopped. The US would make another play for the island in 1910 when Ambassador Maurice Egan tried to acquire Greenland in a confusing three-way trade. He came up with the following plan. The US could swap some of its land in the Philippines for Greenland and the Danish West Indies, and then Denmark could swap the land with Germany. But Egan's proposal was as warmly received as Seward's before him. The Danes heard it, they ignored it, and they went about their business. However, the US would not entirely forget their obsession with Greenland, and as aviation started to take off, acquiring the island became more and more important. Because one of the materials required to produce aluminum for airplanes was cryolite. And though small commercial deposits of cryolite can be found throughout the world in places like Spain and Colorado, the largest natural deposits exist in a mine in Inuviatuk, Greenland. When planes became a necessary fighting tool and advantage during a war, every country would suddenly turn its eyes to this barren island, and the US would get the chance to, if not take over Greenland, at least extract the resources it needed from it. During World War II, Denmark found itself in a dilemma. It had been overrun and captured by Nazis. Though Hitler's army hadn't yet reached Greenland's shores, the island was a point of strategic importance the Nazis were expected to vie for, both for its location and its minerals. At this stage, the US wasn't involved in World War II, but it still invoked the Monroe Doctrine, meant to deter international and particularly European meddling in the Western Hemisphere. In April of 1941, they signed an agreement with the Danish ambassador, known as the Defense of Greenland Agreement. Why the ambassador and not the ruler of Denmark, you might ask? Well, after the Nazi takeover of his country, the Danish ambassador to the US, Henrik Kaufmann, went rogue and declared that he represented the interests of the free and independent Denmark. The agreement he signed established that the US would protect Greenland and its people as long as Denmark was under occupation, and then promptly return the land. The government of Denmark declared the agreement void. Since the government was under Nazi control, Kaufmann didn't really care what they had to say. They then branded Kaufmann a traitor and stripped him of his rank. He still continued to ignore them. The treaty remained in effect. Of course, the US benefited from this agreement too. Not only did they get access to Greenland's extensive cryolite deposits, crucial for a soon-to-be wartime economy, but they also were able to build up US military bases on the island. This gave the US a strategic position much closer to the European front. The Allies also benefited, as they wanted a friendly nation to have control of Greenland so they could maintain access to information from the weather stations on the island. The data from these stations was incredibly important, as most European weather patterns, especially in northwestern Europe where a huge chunk of the war was being fought, originated in the Arctic. Knowing what the troops could expect in upcoming weeks and battles in terms of weather was a crucial advantage. So the US built 2 airports for its army that would eventually become today's Kongeressusorg and Nassarsorg international airports, as well as several military bases, the biggest of which were Blue East 1 and Blue East 2. They also constructed radio and weather stations on the island. The Nazis kept trying to get access to the weather data from the eastern coast of Greenland and actually managed to set up 4 weather stations themselves. However, the US dismantled 2 of them and the other 2 were abandoned. When the war ended in 1945, Denmark was freed from Nazi control. The Danes came calling and asking for Greenland back, as per the terms of the treaty, but the US, like a kid in a pool, was a little reluctant to leave at the end of the day. In 1946, John Hickerson of the State Department said that Greenland was indispensable to the safety of the United States. So the US decided to make an offer to Denmark it couldn't refuse. They first proposed $100 million in gold for Greenland. When the Danes didn't seem to bite, they offered the oil fields in Point Barrow, Alaska, for parts of Greenland. But as it turns out, Denmark didn't care that much about oil and gold, so it could and did refuse both offers. The Danes, though, somewhat horrified by the proposals in the first place, were still masters of restraint. Danish Foreign Minister Gustav Rasmussen said, "While we owe much to America, I do not feel that we owe them the whole island of Greenland." In the meantime, local Greenlanders were thankful to be back and also wanted to be sure Denmark addressed their complaints, especially now that they had realized their land's importance to the Danish kingdom. To its credit, Denmark heard the locals and abolished the monopoly they had over trade with Greenland in 1951, eventually integrating Greenland into the Kingdom of Denmark in 1953. They made serious efforts to improve transportation and education on the island, as well as increase economic opportunities. Greenlanders vied for more and more independence, and Denmark gave in. On May 1, 1979, they declared that Greenland could operate under home rule, essentially becoming semi-autonomous. So, Greenland slowly and successfully took control of its own affairs from Denmark. But it still wasn't in charge of its foreign policy or affairs. This proved problematic when the US decided it would continue to be a presence in Greenland. One problem with the World War II defense treaty signed between the US and Denmark was Article 10. It stated that the US reserved the right to veto any proposed adjustments to the treaty in perpetuity. This means that during the Cold War, Greenland's strategic importance became impossible to ignore. With Denmark calling on its NATO allies for support, the US quietly got to work constructing airfields and military bases across the island. Greenland strategically sat right between the US and the USSR, making it the perfect location for both attack and defense systems against the Soviet Union. So, the US secretly built Thule Air Base in 1951, smack dab in the middle of the US and USSR. It was the perfect location for ships to resupply, nuclear bombers to refuel on their way to Moscow, and American fighters to defend against incoming Soviet planes. 10,000 troops were stationed there at one point. The US also built a base called Camp Century in 1959, though it told the local population it was solely a scientific research center. Camp Century did conduct scientific experiments, such as meteorological studies and ice coring. There was even a nuclear reactor, but it also supported military objectives. Additionally, the US tried building a network of nuclear missile silos under the ice cap, but ultimately construction proved to be impossible due to shifting ice. The ultimate strain on US-Danish Greenlandic relations was the January 21, 1968 crash of an American B-52G bomber off the coast of northwest Greenland. In 1957, Denmark had enacted a nuclear-free policy across its country and territories, banning nuclear weapons from existing or even transiting through any of its land. Unfortunately, the bomber that crashed apparently had not heard of this policy, as it was carrying 4 nuclear bombs. The impact caused the nuclear warheads to be compromised, releasing the radioactive material into a fjord. But at least they didn't detonate, right? It was then revealed that the US had been regularly, illegally flying planes with nuclear cargo over Danish territory. Denmark, unsurprisingly, was not pleased. Neither, we imagine, were the people now surrounded by radioactive water. After these incidents, Greenlanders had started to be somewhat distrustful of and annoyed with the US. There's only so much goodwill protecting a country while building up military bases for a few years can get you, and the US had pretty much run out of it at this point. So in 2004, when the US entered an agreement to upgrade defense systems at Thule Air Base, the issues Greenlanders had with the US presence on the island roared back into the public discourse. When the base was first built during the Cold War, local Inuit had been forcibly removed from the area. Decades later, triggered by the upgrades at the airbase, they sued for their right to return in the European Court of Human Rights. But for many Greenlanders pushing for more independence from Denmark, trading Danish rule for American military oversight wasn't exactly an upgrade, especially when the US did things like storing nuclear bombs on their island without telling anyone. In 2008, a referendum was held to determine if Greenland would get even more independence from the Danish crown. The referendum passed, and Greenland approved the Self-Government Act. That meant that Greenlandic was officially recognized as the only official language, and Danish was dropped. Though a lot of the residents do speak Danish, Greenlandic, and a fair amount of English even today, Greenland could also assume more governing responsibilities without relying on Denmark. For starters, Greenland could now establish its own courts, police, and prisons, as well as regulations regarding border control, finances, family law, and the working environment. However, Greenland's foreign policy, defense policy, and security policy remain squarely within Danish control. So, is it at all possible that now that Greenland is increasingly in charge of its own affairs, they would finally be up for more US involvement, or perhaps becoming a part of the United States itself? Well, it doesn't seem likely. First of all, there's the whole hiding nuclear bombs on our land without telling us situation. It's a tough one to move past. That, along with the US's repeated attempts to buy or possibly invade Greenland, it hasn't exactly won over the locals either. Opinion polls revealed that 85% of Greenlanders opposed joining the US. That's a pretty huge majority. Fewer US adults believe that Santa isn't real. We're not kidding, by the way. A 2022 poll revealed only 79% of US adults don't believe in Santa Claus. In fact, 55% of Greenlanders said that they would prefer to be Danish citizens. After all, that citizenship comes with a fair amount of benefits a US citizenship wouldn't give them, like universal healthcare and free education. Denmark has made it clear it's not selling Greenland, but the US could still take it by force. Of course, invading a peaceful island wouldn't exactly go over well. It would shatter relations with other countries and show a disrespect for international borders with very little upside. We'll explain why. And perhaps most damningly of all, Russia is actually in favor of the US acquiring Greenland. It knows how badly it would fracture the US's relationship with most of Europe. The Prime Minister of Greenland, Mette Frederiksen, is currently pursuing a policy of eventual independence for Greenland, something that the 2009 Declaration of Self-Rule actually allows. The island would just have to vote on full independence in another referendum. Frederiksen has also emphasized that Greenland is not for sale, and its own people should decide the future of the landmass. But Frederiksen seems very open to working with the US for defense and mining purposes. This underscores another problem with the US fragmenting international relations in order to get Greenland. The US is already getting a lot of the benefits it would want from Greenland anyway, without destroying its alliances. The US military maintains a presence at Bitufik Space Base in the northwest part of the island that includes a ballistic missile early warning system. It also receives minerals from the country. Denmark shares intelligence and information with the US. What would even be the point of an acquisition at such a high cost? Should Greenland remain a part of Denmark, or should it just push for full independence? And what do you make of the US's past interest in buying the island? Let us know in the comments below. In the meantime, check out the US plan to invade Canada, or watch this other video.